Hi, everyone. I know it's so great to be in a room together. It's hard to remember we have a program, actually. I'm Catherine Alger. I'm the president here. Welcome to each and every one of you in person and online. We're so glad you could join us for the first in a three-part series of events presented in partnership with the History Project. I want to extend a welcome to lots of new faces that I see out there. And I think, as Amanda said, really encourage you to get to know the MHS. You know, a lot of us have memories of history class and they weren't good people, right? A lot of names and dates. But we believe that history instead is beyond the names and dates, but a powerful tool that can shape our understanding of the world we're in and the world we want to build. Through our extensive collection here in this building of primary source materials, educational programs, and research initiatives, we always aim to engage the past in a way that resonates with the present. We firmly believe that the lessons of history, they're subtle, they're not always clear, but they can guide us toward a better future. And it's our mission here at the MHS to facilitate that journey. It's why we're free and open to the public. We can come in anytime, and there's a whole staff of wonderful professionals to help you satisfy your curiosity about the past. So, as I said this evening, we have a new series that will look at Gay Community News, a pioneering LGBTQ plus newspaper that has shaped the landscape of queer journalism for 5 decades. And before I turn things over to Joan Illacgua, I want to remind you to mark your calendars. So part 2 of the series will be on November 8th and part 3 on November 29th. Okay, now's the part for Joan Illacgua. Joan is the executive director of the History Project. She's led it since January 2020. She served as co-chair of the History Project's board of directors and at Harvard Medical School's Archivist for Diversity and Inclusion. She's also a member of our Regional Diversity and Inclusion Committee, the New England Archivists, and has a background in advocacy and oral history. She is a graduate of UMass Boston's Public History Master's Program and earned her Bachelor of Arts at the University of Puget Sound. This was officially on our biography, so I can't resist mentioning in her free time, she likes to read queer romance novels and spend time with her wife and 2 lazy cats, which Joan is like heaven for me. So here we go.
If you want recommendations of what to read, you can find me. So I'm Joan Illacgua. I'm the executive director of the History Project. And first, I just wanted to say thank you so much, MHS, for hosting us all here. It's a lovely venue. I'm so glad to be here with you in person and for our friends online. The History Project, for those of you who are new, is Boston's LGBTQ plus community archives. Since 1980, so not as long as MHS, we have documented, preserved, and shared LGBTQ history in Boston, Massachusetts, and New England regionally. So I'd also like to say thank you to the American LGBTQ plus Museum, who are sponsoring tonight's panel, and also to Northeastern University's Archives and Special Collections, who have digitized all of GCN. So if you haven't looked at that online, go. So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's panel and moderator. And we are starting with Richard Burns, who is moderating. Richard lived in Boston from 1977 through 1986. And was managing editor and later president of the board of GCN, and was the chair of the founding board of GLAAD. He was the executive director of New York's LGBT Community Center from 1986 to 2009, and today he's come full circle to serve as the interim executive director of GLAAD. Welcome back. Next, we have Russ Lopez. Russ is the author of 6 nonfiction books, including The Hub of the Gay Universe, An LGBTQ History of Boston, Provincetown, and Beyond. Originally from California, with degrees from Stanford, Harvard, and BU, Russ lives in Boston and Provincetown, and he is a proud member of the board of directors of the History Project. We have Gordon Gottlieb next. Gordon started as a volunteer proofreader for GCN in 1977. He became copy editor the following year, a role that he filled nonstop into the 1990s. He was on staff, managing, then coordinating editor for 2 years from 1984 to 1986. And then last but not least, Loie Hayes. Loie started volunteering at GCN shortly after moving to Boston in 1982. She joined the board in 1983, and in 1984, she was hired as features editor. She was burnt out by 1987. Since 2005, she's worked on climate change issues. Loie's also raised 2 kids with her wife, Julie Ogletree, a former GCN features contributor, and the kid's dad, Andrew Wicker, a member of United Fruit Company. And both kids are non-binary and or queer identified. You recruit. I will turn it over to you, Richard. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, so hi, everyone. It's great to be here. And imagine it's 1973. U.S. troops are withdrawing from Vietnam. Roe versus Wade has been decided. The Watergate hearings are just beginning. And in 1973, they put something in the water because that's the year that PFLAG was founded, that the National Gay Task Force was founded. It was the year Lambda Legal was founded, and it was the year Gay Community News was founded. All entities that have had huge impacts on our movement for queer liberation. So, and of course, they're all celebrating in different ways. None of them together.
The tradition continues.
Exactly. So I want to start by acknowledging 2 former editors, Neil Miller, who was news editor in the 1970s, Amy Hoffman, who became features editor and then in the 70s and managing editor in 1980. And there are lots and lots of former staff and board members in the room. And by the time I got there in 1977, in the fall, when I got out of college, moved to Boston specifically to join the Gay Community News Collective, I started out, of course, as a Friday folder and stuffed envelopes and ate pizza. And I kept coming back until they hired me and started, and ultimately in early 78, became managing editor. And I want to, before we begin the questions with the panelists, I just want to, again, lay the foundation that in the 1970s, it was very, very unusual for lesbians and gay men to work together. And this was a co-ed weekly newspaper. That was unusual. You know, you had gay male misogynists, you had Alex Dobkin and Lavender Jane. And so it was not really that together, except at GCN. And GCN, the other thing to remember was at that time, there was no true national movement. The National Gay Task Force was founded in New York in Bruce Veller's kitchen in 73, but it was only national because they put national in the name. That was it. And because this is before email, this is before fax machines, activists actually could not afford long distance phone calls. And so we corresponded with other movements via the mail. And in those days, one of our slogans was, our readers are our writers. Because all around the country, the way we became national and had coverage was readers would write for free. But as it's a little militaristic, but some of us called Gay Community News a weapon of queer liberation. And perhaps we could call it now an engine of gay liberation. So again, Anita Bryant was coming to Boston in this moment to yell at us. But in Boston, you had FAGRAG, you had the Boston Gay Review, you had Sister Courage, you had Sojourner. Elaine Noble was elected as an out lesbian. GCN was in Barney Frank's district when he represented us in the legislature. He was not out of the closet. And so all of this was going on before AIDS, before 82 and 83. So that's the foundation. And our first question is going to be a flash round. and I'll start with you, Loie, is when were you at GCN? What was your role? And who were you before you got there? And why did you come?
Pardon me if I start coughing. I have a chronic throat thing. It's not contagious. And Gordon has promised to take over if I have a fit. So I was just moved to Boston. I was, I think, 26. I had been out for a while, and I had been living in DC and volunteering with the Off Our Backs newspaper. I had been a writer since I was a teenager, et cetera. So that was my avocation. I was a short order cook and had been a house painter. So GCN was a very vibrant organization. I started volunteering. I remember folding chairs after some lesbian rock band concert with Kevin Cathcart or something. So eventually I was drafted for the board, I think when Kevin left, and the board, and then eventually I think I applied 3 times and finally got the job of features editor when David Morris left. So that's a summary.
Thank you. So Gordon, who were you? How'd you get there? Why'd you come?
So let's see. So I was in college locally at Tufts, and essentially viewed my 4 undergraduate years as a coming out exercise. Academics were kind of peripheral. And I actually came to GCN after being on the staff, or not on the staff, being the leader of the student, what was called the Tufts gay community. The rest of the letters came much later. But we got GCN. And so I would read it avidly every week and kind of look at the names on the bylines and who are these people? They must be amazing, blah, blah, blah. And so I actually just created an internship to work at GCN. I mean, to come to GCN and get some credit for it. And so I started out as a proofreader, which was a very happy place to be if you're sort of, disciplined, perhaps pedantic, probably, and have appreciation for knowledge. And back in those days, I developed very good skills with an X-Acto knife because we had to literally cut out the old letters themselves.
Cut out the 0 and the A, and then reverse the order.
Yes, right. And as Amy once pointed out, and half of them fell off by the time they got to the printer. Robert Etherington was the copy editor before me, and then he left. And so I think, Richard, you just told me one day, okay, you're the copy editor. Deus ex machina. And so I was the copy editor then for, all the time through the early 90s. So Thursday nights were sort of the time to do that. And in, I think it was so it would have been 84. The then managing editor, Cindy Patton, came up to me and said, I'm going to be leaving. I think you should apply for my job. And I, being the normal, charming, diplomatic person I am, I said, you're out of your fucking mind. And she persisted. I applied. I did get it. Remember, Amy asked me if I was going to, even when I took the job, was I going to continue to wear a tie? Because I was that kind of guy back then. And so I was on the staff from 84 to 86. Got time off for good behavior, and then resumed my proofreading responsibilities as copy editor. Also worked on the Sustainer program, which was the major donor in quotes fundraising program we had, and then kind of stayed with the paper until it transitioned into its journal status.
Thank you, Russ.
First, I'll have to say, as I never had an official role at GCN, I just would hang out there so often. Everybody thought I must be doing something important. I was probably the little twink, if you remember, in the corner. It's hard to think of it those days, but I was just a little kid, right? And I'd be like, hi, and every time they try to give me a serious job, like with an X-Acto knife, I think I cut myself, and they took that away. And then there was answering the phones, and I just started chatting with somebody, and they took that away. So I kept going, right? And it was a big part of my my early adulthood. And the reason why I went was because actually before I moved to Boston, somebody had handed me a copy of GCN. So in California, it already had quite the circulation. So when I got to Harvard, I go, oh, this is what I'm going to do. So that's what I did.
Well, thank you for saying that. In the 70s, GCN ended up with subscribers in all 50 states and 12 foreign countries, and was distributed on newsstands and bookstores throughout the country through a alternative book distribution firm that Sasha Allison founded many, many years. Oh, I'm sorry. Many, many years before he started Bay Windows. And so there was this circulation in places like California. And in 1977 and 78, Gay Community News had 10 full-time staff, which were all part of the larger collective. And that made the staff size larger than the task force, than the LA Center, than any other organization at that time. Who had 10 full-time staff? Well, the staff made $70 a week with no benefits in 1978. Right. After taxes, $70 is 63 and change. Went up to 80 in 79 and 90, and then it went to 100 in 1980. And you mentioned the sustainers. Eric Rofus, who had been features editor and left the staff, founded the Sustainer program specifically to buy health benefits for the staff, because up until then they hadn't been any. And I remember Tess, Louise, Betsy, all of you being engaged in that Sustainer program, because we thought, who's going to give $100? Like, nobody. But it was Eric's idea, and we ended up with benefits. So now to the second question. Can you tell one quick story that reveals the impact on our movement for queer liberation, the impact that GCN had? Loie.
Sure. I think like many women at the time, I had come up through the Take Back the Night movement, where we were really trying to deal with the fact that we were afraid to go out of our homes without protection in the night, et cetera. And this morphed into the porn wars. It's a long morph. But I think that GCN played an enormous role, particularly for lesbians, for lesbian feminists, to make that metamorphosis from we are victims and we're taking the power back to protect ourselves and we're doing martial arts, et cetera, to recognizing that the anti-porn crusade that also came out of the feminist movement was going to be a legal minefield for queer liberation and beyond. And I think that was a really crucial role that the organization played. And it involved many, many articles from different points of view and respecting and taking seriously those different points of view. I contributed one editorial at the time when Massachusetts was considering a McKinnon-type anti-porn law, acknowledging, the victimization that I had experienced and recognizing misogyny distorts women's ability to own their desire, and how the McKinnon proposition was going to be a furtherance of that silencing rather than a liberation from violence. So that, to me, I think was really a profound place that the GCN conversation allowed us to have, and allowed women to process and come to terms with very different points of view.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna answer your question twice, but I'll try to be short. So the GCN, I think, had an impact on the movement just by being, in the sense that it became a focal point for people, for activists of all sorts. And so certainly in the 70s into the 80s, I think if you were queer and you were in Boston, you would come to GCN if you were political. I see Abe right back in the audience. Abe, reminded me the other day that the first day he came to Boston, he came to GCN. Yeah. And, and so we started talking, and, Jewish geography, it turns out I know his cousins. So, but that was, it wasn't just Abe, it was lots of people coming, and it was just a hotbed of activity. And many of these people then went on, even after they left GCN, to found organizations, to be active in the movement in multiple roles. And, I think we always sort of patted ourselves on the back for saying, you started out at GCN and, you've sprung and you're in wonderful places. So that's one impact. The other impact, sort of building on what you were saying, is sex. So I don't even remember who it was. Somebody said, GCN puts the sex back in homosexuality. Because we talked about it. There was, in the old days, there was that tension between the respectable people and the non-respectable queers. And, so in nice company, you don't talk about sex. And of course, GCN did. And so there were the porn wars stuff. There was all kinds of stuff. But NAMBLA, thank you. Yes, right, exactly. So lots of issues. And so I won't sort of, I will say two ways it sort of came to bite me in the ass, but not in a good way. So one was, so my parents, God bless them, despite their concerns about, having, me being in such a public facing role, and if it's on my resume, what's going to happen to their little boy? So, but they subscribed and they don't, so. And, I always wondered, well, do they read the paper? And I got my answer, because once I'm on the phone with my mom, and she's using this voice that's clearly, she knows she's overstepping. And she says, Gordy, could you explain lesbian S&M to me? It was a short phone call. The other, and another way sort of sex came to sort of, I had to deal with it specifically is, so every Thursday night was production night, and, at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning, some of us would, pile into a taxi, drive to Charles River Publishing, and then it was, then we would hand over the flats, the boards to the printer, and show them all the illustrations we were using, and technology was such that we would sort of, here's the book that you need to take the photograph from, and then place it in the right place, blah, 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 blah. So at one point, I get a call from Richard Weinstein, I think was his name. He was the owner of Charles River Publishing. And he said, we have to meet.
And was it the barbed wire cock?
That's what it was. Yes, it was the barbed wire cock. But yes, right, exactly. And he proceeded to tell me what we could not do. And it was essentially no shuns, no penetrations, no erections, no insertions, well, you know, all these kind of stuff. And I just said, oh, good to know. And left it at that. And we continued to do what we did. So
Russ.
I'm actually thought of two things, so I'll be quick. First of all, even if you were political, every week you had to open up to find out, to read the ad that began "Mousy, Mousy, Wildflower." And at a time where love wasn't really mentioned in the LGBTQ queer community, it was just pure love and joy every week. So even the non-political people read GCN just for that, if nothing else. But for those of us who were political, I think one of the most lasting legacies was their coverage of issues like with Sharon Kowalski, a woman in a long-term relationship with her partner, was in a car accident, some sort of accident, and her parents took that as an opportunity to sort of steal her away from her long lifetime partner and control her, when she was basically incapacitated. And that was covered for years with the legal battles that went on and everything else. That was, I believe, in the early 80s. I could be wrong, mid 80s, certainly at the latest. But for those of us who then, became, when I first went to GCN, I went there to get laid. I was kind of mistaken. Actually, I wasn't mistaken. But anyway, but those of us who then developed relationships over the 80s and 90s, when the marriage debate began in the 90s, the fate of Sharon and her partner was very much in our minds, up through and including all the madness that went on at the State House after marriage was actually approved by the Supreme Judicial Court in 2003. So that had a very lasting effect on all of us. There's a lot of post-marriage analysis saying that it was really my background comes from the radical left, that why did they go for marriage when they should have just actually opposed that institution altogether? They should have abolished marriage and all the privileges that went with it. And I think still that's a very valid question. But for those of us in Boston who went on in this marriage fight, it was the memory of what GCN had seared into our hearts about poor Sharon and her partner, that really said you really had to have laws on your side if you're gonna, go through life with somebody, because at any moment a car could hit you, I don't know what exactly, a motorcycle or something rather, could hit you, and then the family could take everything away that you've ever had. So it really, 20 years after this series of articles, it still permeated the consciousness of those of us from Boston.
Thank you. I think the coverage or story that I think of as having a major impact on our movement was the organizing around the 1979 March on Washington, which took place in October 14 of 1979. And as I mentioned earlier, there was really not a national movement. There were a lot of local movements that were disconnected. And in February of 79, there was a national congress at the Friends Meeting House in Philadelphia to call for the March on Washington. And each state was supposed to send delegates. And so Eric Rofus and Amy Hoffman and myself and Dee Michelle anointed ourselves as the delegates from Massachusetts and rented a car and went down to Philadelphia in a snowstorm. And all these activists, like the Salsa Soul Sisters from New York and the gay Democrats from San Diego, were locked in the Friends Meeting House for 2 or 3 days to hammer out the demands for this march and the title of the march. And, it was, I think, the March for Lesbian and Gay Liberation and the March on Washington. But GCN covered every week the development of this march, and then the march itself did a special issue to hand out to everyone there. And the reason of the place where I think GCN had an impact on the development of our national movement was this engagement with subscriber activists around the country so that they could be a part of sort of the ideation of what this national movement was going to demand and B, and then emerge after the March on Washington. And then, things began to be more national because activists knew each other from around the country. They had fought in the wars together. And Meg Christian came and sang Somewhere Over the Rainbow. and so that's where I think GCN did have an impact at that moment in time. So our next question for our panelists is, what is your favorite article or a critical issue that you remember? Loie.
I, of course, will name my own, one of my own. That was a features article on a brigade, a cotton picking brigade of North Americans who went to Nicaragua together to support the Sandinista movement, the revolution. This was, I don't know, 83, something like that. And it was, I love it because it captured the, person-to-person diplomacy that in a sense has to happen to create gay liberation. And that is where one person who has acknowledged this is my reality, I am queer, begins the conversation with somebody who does not share that reality and says, your ideology believes I don't exist, but for a fact that I exist. So how can we talk about your ideology and process that? So it's a really interesting event. It certainly characterized, GCN did lots of articles about the Sandinista revolution because there was so much promise there in that first decade of the revolution, the Constitution, et cetera, and the leadership, not to mention how queer the leadership was, particularly of the lesbian Sandinistas or the women Sandinistas who were lesbians. So that was really wonderful. And we did an off-the-record interview with Margaret Randall, who had been privy to, had been living and working very closely with the Sandinistas. And so it was a really wonderful opportunity for me. And I think it characterized a very interesting contribution that GCN made to the movement, largely that internationalism, and that, as you were saying, the only way we found out about people was, found out about each other was writing letters, and then, in fact, printing those letters in a weekly newspaper and following up on the issues year after year. So.
Thanks. Gordon.
So I don't have a specific article, but I want to sort of hold up the book review section, because once a month, was it 8 pages? It felt like it was a lot. GCN was devoted to reviews of books. And in the 1980s, when I was there, at least, there was a feminist press, there was a lesbian press, there was sort of a gay press, and then there were some mainstream publishers as well. But it was exciting when a book came out. It got attention, and it was looked at and scrutinized, and there were 10 to 15 reviews each section, and those of you who are the features editors, I bow down before you for dealing with that, because it was it's such a juggling act to do, just to produce that. But it helped convey to the world, and to your point, Richard, yes, so the GCN was sort of going into 50 states plus other countries, and for some people, this is the only way they were going to know that these books existed. And so I think that was a huge contribution that probably had ripple effects that we're not even aware of.
For me, and I apologize, maybe this is a little bit too much focused on myself here. It was reading about incarceration and the whole prison industrial complex in the United States. I mean, now we all know about that, but at least for me, when I was this innocent child, I had no idea. And though no one talked about the concept of intersectionality yet. This is right before, I guess, Barbara Smith, also a great Bostonian, Canterburysian, with the Combahee River Collective. It came out with that statement that really launched, I think, the whole idea of intersectionality and the connections between queer liberation and women's liberation and everything else. GCN was there, and I think helped set that philosophy, as it were. So for me, it was reading that and going like, wow, these issues are our issues. And that had a tremendous impact on me, at least, I mean, my life, and my work that went forward from there. And I think a lot of other people, we all knew that there was connections because of what GCN wrote about. There was nothing that was really off limits, right? Some of the things I didn't agree with, you could reach a limit for just about anybody, though I guess, well, maybe not everybody, but some people are clearly having a good time with some things. But in general, I mean, if GCN really had a perspective and an intelligence collectively, if you want to think about that hive of people, that was miles ahead of the rest of the U.S. society. I think a good chunk of our society has moved in that direction. Not enough of us, but certainly a good chunk of us have now internalized some of the ideas that GCN was pioneering.
I think for me, the issue that GCN covered that had a major impact on my thinking, and I think on much of our movement, was its regular coverage of abortion rights. In the 1970s, we didn't say reproductive justice. We said abortion rights. And for most of our movement, it was not a gay issue. It was not covered in gay press at that time, but it was covered. And this was under Neil's editorship, and Nancy Wexler's writing constantly, that abortion rights are not just a lesbian feminist issue, not just a women's issue, but a gay liberation issue. And there were many, many men in our community at that time who would angrily say to me, it's not our issue. It's not a gay issue. Why are you writing about it? And in the face of that denial, GCN kept at it. And what was wonderful is GCN explained why it was a gay issue. And that's how you help change minds and change the direction of a movement. And so I think that is an issue where I think GCN had a critical impact on our movement, and it's just one of my favorite stories that we covered. It sounds weird to say favorite story, important story. All right. Next question, Loie. What was the impact of your GCN experience on your life?
Well, it was my first full-time writer-editor gig. I went on to, be a book editor for many years. So it was a wonderful skill-building opportunity. The intersectionality that you were talking about, Russ, it was so fundamental to what our thinking was, that it was, has been, shaped, as you said, my consciousness. The battles that we had about class, oh Lord, the battles that we had about class were so provocative that I think I will never stop thinking about that. Certainly I was burned out by the end of it. But it was a marvelous education, shall we say. And I certainly left a much more sophisticated thinker than I came in.
Yeah, the whole exposure to multiple issues, we didn't have the word intersectionality back then, but we are an anti-racist feminist, and I think there are about 3 more categories of to define GCN that we sort of would trot out anytime we had to describe it. I mean, that was, I think it was new to me. I mean, I sort of I saw these separate issues, but I never, before GCN, I think, was in a space that pulled them all together. So it was hugely important for my political understanding and development. That was one, huge impact. So I have a background in human resources and ultimately went on from sort of just being a straight HR guy to being an organizational development consultant. So for the last 25 years, I was able to look back at my time, particularly on staff at GCN, and draw many valuable lessons on what not to do when managing a nonprofit organization. So I learned many things. We were joking the other day. You still see the scars, and then let me just make one diversion. You talked about sort of the class battles. Being at GCN was amazing. It was never easy. So for those of you who are perhaps less connected with GCN at the time, please don't go away thinking it was fun and romping and unicorns, other than the classified. So because it was hard, it was incredibly hard, and I just want you to know that. But the final thing, the other impact it had on me in a very personal way is, I met the love of my life there. Started out as a friend, started out as a proofreader. Then became a friend, then became a boyfriend, then became a partner, then became a husband, and he's in the room now, Rob. So that's a lifelong impact for which I am very grateful.
Oh, nice. Russ.
Yeah, I guess I should also say that it was because of dear Eric Rofus that I met my husband, who we just celebrated our 39th year together. And next year will be 40 years together. And so I keep thinking, as getting ready for this panel, of people like Eric and Urvashi Vade and the others who aren't with us, who did so much both at GCN and for the world, I'd say. So that's one thing. When I started work on my queer history of Boston, Hub of the Gay Universe, and LGBTQ history of Boston, Provincetown, and beyond. How's that for a plug? It was really because of GCN was one piece of that, because I thought that Boston had something other cities didn't. I mean, people would go to San Francisco to do whatever they did in San Francisco. AIDS activism was clearly centered in New York. I'm not quite sure what Chicago's contribution, but I'm sure they're very nice people. But Boston had GCN, and think of all the people who were associated with that, who went on to run the gay world, right? The gay universe, right? And so I kept thinking that story had to be told, and more than just GCN. Obviously, there's other things: the Boston marriages, the folks in the 19th century, everything else. But it was really to tell the context of GCN, among other things, that prompted me to write the book. And so far, no one's thrown a pie in my face. It's always difficult to write history when people who made it are reading it, right? But anyway, it was sort of my homage to folks who did so much and helped make the world a better place, even though, of course, the world isn't perfect yet, but I guess we're still working on that.
Thank you. Well, GCN really changed my life as well. I had heard about it when I was an undergraduate in rural upstate New York at Hamilton College, and I told the library, got them to subscribe, and I read GCN and read about the Fort Hill Faggots for Freedom, and I thought, when I graduate, I'm going to move to Boston, and I'm going to join that collective. And so I did, and I became a waiter in Harvard Square, and started showing up at GCN until they hired me. And every Tuesday night, the collective would meet. And sometimes it would meet for 4 hours. And somebody always cried. And you had to attend 3 collective meetings in a row and be a volunteer in order to get a vote. And then once you had done that, met that criteria, you were a member of the collective and you could vote. And it could be, very dramatic and very powerful. But that process, like you, I learned a lot about what not to do. But I learned I'd never be in another collective. It did politically change me forever and really determined the course of the rest of my life. If not for GCN, I would, I'd be an alcoholic partner in a law firm, probably, and went in a very, very different direction, and was so shaped and formed by the people. And GCN was a young place, but it wasn't only a young place. There were early 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and ultimately 70s. And there was lots of sex and lots of heartbreak and lots of STDs and the lesbians, lots of flagell and amoebas. And what was weird about it in a good way was it was a very rare place where the lesbians and the gay men who were discovering themselves and having sex and relationships shared all of that together as queer culture. And that really, I think, shaped the lives of many people, specifically, and very much so me. So it definitely led me to be a lifelong activist. And I think that's true of so many people who left GCN, which, as Gordon said, was a real cauldron and could be a hard place, but a wonderful place. There was a reunion on the 30th anniversary, a 2-day conference in New York at the LGBT Center, where people came and there was programming, and different generations of GCN met each other there for the first time. And it's hard to believe now that it's 20 years later, that it's GCN 50. So we have a few more minutes and we want to open it up to the room for questions. And questions with the queer activist crowd often means speeches. So we know what we're getting into. You're on.
I wanted to ask you your experience working on the paper. If you had a really serious challenge from the outside that almost threatened the existence of the paper, and also from the inside.
Well, the fire in 1982, arsonists burned us out.
Yeah.
So yes.
Big time.
Who were they? Do you know?
Well, 22 Bromfield Street, owned by the Drucker Company. I think the second floor is still burnt out and empty. How many years? That's 40 years later. There was a photography shop downstairs. Angela Russo, volunteer photographer, worked there. And we were upstairs, and Glad Day Bookstore was across the hall. Fag Rag and Boston Gay Review were in the back. And periodically people would shoot through the windows sometimes, and we were broken into on a periodic basis, ransacked. But the arson fire was in March of 82, July of 82. And so that was threatening. And John Ward, founder of GLAD, GCN's pro bono council, just said, come on over and have my conference room. And we did not miss an issue. Immediately went and took over his conference room until we rented a space on Tremont Street, an old beauty school.
And just to piggyback on that, and rest assured, the police were not exactly engaged with it. So you can just imagine. Yes. And the second part of your question was,
within the community, I guess.
So Richard talked about sort of the reaction of gay men to GCN being a place where both women and men work together and collaborate, and therefore, I remember talking to men who said, I don't want to, when I flip through pages, I don't want to see either body parts or even just subject matter that didn't appeal to them, so and that was a kind of a frequent and misogynist theme that we experienced.
Well, and I'll just add capitalism, that
Oh, that.
in capitalism, any little percolation of creativity and innovation finds its niche and can blossom and can flourish. And then as soon as it's flourishing, it's like, oh, we can monetize that. And so, there were other papers created that scooped up the bar ads and scooped up the other things and were non-political. Appropriate. Yeah, exactly. And that certainly contributed to difficulties, if not, the dissolution.
Anybody else?
So you said in 1973 there's something in the water, and that's certainly true for because up here and me and Steve are from Maine, and that's also when Maine started their gay liberation movement with the Wild Stein Club. But my question was, so in celebrating all of our 50th anniversary stuff, a lot of things that have come up for a lot of younger queer people is, how do we get this back? Because there isn't a place to go to anymore. It's kind of scattered to the seven winds. There's the internet, but that's not quite the same. And so I guess, do you have any advice for if we try to restart it?
You'll probably get 4 answers that are different. I will say there are over 320 LGBT community centers in the United States. And that is where a lot of on-the-ground organizing is happening today. People who come in looking for a boyfriend or a girlfriend or to find and build community, and they get seduced into activism. and I think that is one of the places where we all have to build it. Nobody's going to give it to us. We're only going to reap what we sow, and we have to build it.
Yeah, I would say again, to find those niches that where there is something powerful that's bringing people together, finding the boyfriends and the girlfriends and the finding ways to express your creativity, etc. And it won't be gay community news because that was of that moment. But there's always something.
I've often thought that, given the aging of the cohort that was involved with GCN, that somebody will retire and think to start up sort of kind of an online thing. And there's a lot of online queer things out there, but there's nothing fills the role of GCN. There's nothing with the right perspective. There's nothing with I should say from the left perspective, right? There's nothing for the perspective I would like to see. There's nothing that has the range of people involved. At someplace should be able to get together and do that. I'm not volunteering for that, but I can volunteer other people.
Before we go to the next question, one thing I just want to acknowledge that because we're talking mostly about the 1970s and early 80s, we haven't been talking about AIDS and the terrifying early years, the first 10 years of AIDS before protease inhibitors happened, the dying years, the war years, the ACT UP years. And I think though that will be a much bigger topic in the subsequent panels. Because we're focusing on the earlier years of GCN. But I did just want to acknowledge that GCN played a role both in covering AIDS and around AIDS activism as it developed. I mean, ACT UP was founded in the spring of '87, and GCN was still strong at that time. And I think helped spread ACT UP around the country and the world. So I just wanted to acknowledge that omission, because I think that will be a focus of subsequent panels. Roberta.
Whilst we missed our chance of building a gay center, that I know that there was work on one maybe it was in the early 2000s, or I don't know, even before that. But the closest thing that I can think of to get people together to talk about their culture is the History Project. There have been so many, wonderful, readings and panels and, doing things on Pride. And I mean, it is it's an organization that doesn't really, it doesn't have the kind of boundaries where they say, oh, that's not our job. It's like they're willing to look at, cultural issues that come up or cultural things that come up and say, this is something we can do something about.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm curious about the relationship to an African-American queer community in Boston at the time, and what, when you were thinking and talking about an intersectionality, what was going on in that space?
GCN was very white. As was mentioned, the Combahee River Collective and the Take Back the Night marches were there. If you were around, you know about the murders of Black women. Now GCN covered that, but it was a very, very white place. And I think that some other cities were different. And in many cities, though, and we weren't talking about intersectionality, as was said, we didn't use that word. But GCN did identify as anti-racist and had anti-racist committees and trainings, but it was not at that time in the 70s a truly multiracial organization. What would you all add?
I know just that there was an effort made by the white people who were inhabiting the space of GCN to be conscious of that, but it was still very white supremacist in that sense.
I think the lesbian and gay liberation movement in Boston at that time was not perceived as particularly welcoming to a multiracial world. And Amy, what were you going to add?
I was just going to add that something I've thought about a lot in relation to this is looking at Boston itself at that time, which was an incredibly racially divided city. The busing stuff was happening. There were race riots. People were getting killed and attacked. And so I think that it's hard to look at GCN and the LGBTQ movement during the 70s and early 80s without looking at the world we were living in.
Yeah, I will note, I was flipping through back issues of GCN today, and the coverage of the Rainbow Coalition, Mel King's campaign, which I think was 83 or so. 83. Yeah, and there was such a strong coalition that embodied that campaign. I think that made a difference. But that was, again, a signifier of the beginning of a coalition that was actually forming and that was pragmatic and action oriented.
I think you also have to understand also how segregated the LGBT community was. I mean, I remember actually at the History Project one day, we were talking about old bars and somebody was going about Boston and Metro, this place on Lansdowne Street, changed its names about a dozen times, but was the place to go on a Sunday night. And somebody asked me, because I'm now, even though I was the young kid then, now I'm the old fart. Somebody asked me, well, what was it like? And I go, I don't know, I couldn't get in because I was Latino, right? So, hey, the whole of Boston was segregated. And I think that there was no crossing between Black and Latinx, use that term then, communities and the white community, so that you would even have the beginnings of people I mean, so much of GCN really was social, even if you were fighting till 2 a.m. sometimes. But it was social, right? People oftentimes got really involved because they had friends who were involved. And because there weren't interracial friendships in those days as much as there are today, I think that it was much harder to recruit people.
This very much parallels feminism at the time, not just in Boston, but really around the country.
And the left.
Yes. Yeah. One more before we close.
Back in the day, in the early years, how did you all view all the mainstream and now were they a problem?
Well, they ignored us. Remember, this was the day of the avowed homosexual,
Yes.
which was what the New York Times, that was their, book of usage was avowed homosexual. God, do you remember Dudley Clendenin was assigned to the Times in New York, was in Boston, was in the closet, would not return our phone calls. And then, of course, comes out in New York and writes a big book about like gay life. And I wanted to murder him. And the Globe was not our friend for all of their so-called liberalism. I mean, remember, Dukakis was our enemy. And the Herald American, I mean, what led to the founding of GLAAD in 1978, Suffolk County District Attorney Garrett Byrne was running for re-election, and his platform was the Revere sex ring, which he invented, and who put it on the front page all the time? The Hearst-owned Boston Herald American. They declared war on us, and Elaine Noble calls for an anonymous hotline. Anybody could report anybody if they suspect them of man-boy love. And John Ward, I have to say, he founded GLAAD, came out of the Boston Boise Committee, which was the organizing group around the Revere sex ring and Garrett Byrne. And some of you who are around will remember Gore Vidal coming to speak at the Arlington Street Church, $5 a head, benefit for the Boston Boise Committee. Robert Bonin, the head of the Supreme Judicial Court, bought a ticket and he was driven from office. He was going to be impeached and had to resign because he had bought a ticket to that. And that is the context of, and who was writing about it and helping them drive him out was the Herald American and the Boston Globe. So in answer to your question, they were our enemies.
Follow up. Have things changed for the better?
Sure, of course, of course. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yes. Yes, you are absolutely right.
K. Longcoat.
Very wonderful, wonderful person. Yeah.
In a slightly more benign way, Barry Forbes, who was a board member and volunteer, worked at WGBH. And so when they were doing their pledge drives one year, he arranged to have GCN staff the phones. And the discomfort of the guy who was the GBH employee who was, telling people to call this number, and we have people from Community News. So,
So
allyship came a little late.
it is 7:03 and we want to be good guests. And so first, I want to thank the Massachusetts Historical Society. I want to thank the American LGBTQ plus Museum of History and Culture. And I really, really just want to scream thanks to the Boston History Project for doing this series. I'm always afraid that gay community news will be forgotten. And I think that the History Project has really made sure that won't happen. And so I just want to say thank you. And thank you, Loie, Gordon, Russ. It's been fun. Loie and I were office roommates at some point. So I heard all about her sex life.
And I just want to give a special shout out to one of our organizers, Michael Bronsky, who couldn't be here tonight, and who I thank for many delightful hours talking about sex lives.
All right. Thank you.
I always like to throw backwards in the